the ending of Naxalism certainly boosts India's comprehensive national power, and it does so in a number of ways. It does so by boosting internal security, economic growth, and also India's ability to, in a sense, project power externally. What this clearly means is that the Indian state is sort of demonstrating its capability to counter a decades long Naxal movement, which rejects the Indian state itself. It has successfully been able to put that down. So it obviously boosts the Indian state's credibility and credentials, especially from a security perspective.
Namaste and welcome. I'm Swareena Singh and this is the Global Order. Earlier this year, on 31st of March, the Government of India declared the country free of Naxalism, or what we know as left-wing extremism, one of India's most formidable internal security challenges. But when we talk about it, how many of us truly understand its origins, what the movement stood for, what it means when the government says that it has eliminated it, and much more? To understand these questions, we have with us today Mr. Kamal Madishetti, Assistant Professor at the Rashtam School of Public Leadership at the Rishihar University. He is a visiting fellow at the India Foundation, and previously in 2023, he was India's official representative at G20's youth consultancy group, the Y20. Over the years, his research has specialized across international relations, global affairs, and geopolitics. However, he has closely followed the development and evolution of left-wing extremism. Dr. Kamal, thank you so much for joining us today and being here on Global Order.
Thank you so much, Swareena. It's a pleasure to be on this podcast, which I've been following for a long time.
Thank you, sir. When we're talking about left-wing extremism, I do want to start with understanding what exactly it is. What do we mean when we talk about Naxalism? Where did it originate? And what does one expect to understand when we say left-wing extremism?
I think left-wing extremism or Naxalism, as it's also called, it's one of India's and the Indian state's greatest security challenges. And this is not me saying it; this is the former Prime Minister saying it. You know, since independence, if you look at the various security challenges India has faced, the left-wing extremism problem certainly ranks among the top few. It has its certain, background. It started out in West Bengal in the sort of place called Naxalbari. That's where the term Naxalism comes from, and it was, I think, in the Darjeeling district. It's to be 1967 to be precise. There were people like Charu Majumdar, Kanu Sanyal, who basically mobilized local peasants into an armed uprising against feudal landlords. And this was, framed as a struggle for land rights. And this eventually then led to the formation of the Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist, in a couple of years later, which at its core rejects India's parliamentary democracy. It views the Indian state as its enemy. And there's been an entire trajectory as far as this movement is concerned. But the important thing is that once this movement gained some kind of a hold, the Indian state obviously had a response. And, in the initial years, let's say, because I'm talking about 1969, so in the early 1970s, the movement somehow in somewhat sort of declined. But then there was, a rise again in the 1980s, especially after somebody called K. Sitaramaya in the state of Andhra Pradesh. He formed the People's War Group. He shifted the base of this movement not in open areas, but into deep tribal forests. So that was a sort of an evolution that happened. But the single most important development as far as the evolution of left-wing extremism and the history of it is concerned was in the year 2004. What happened in 2004 was this People's War Group that I mentioned merged with what is called the Maoist Communist Center of India. Now, the People's War Group was mainly sort of centered around Andhra and in the southern states. It was very sophisticated in terms of its tactical planning, whereas the MCCI, the other entity, was mainly based around Jharkhand, Bihar, and the north and the eastern parts of the country. And that sort of group was far more ruthless in its tactics, in its operations. So, what we saw in 2004 was a coming together of both these groups. And from that emerged the Communist Party of India, which merged into a unified, force which had a very sophisticated leadership as well. It had a politburo. Right, it was very sophisticated as compared to the previous entity. It had its own force, which was called the People's Liberation Guerrillas Army. Right, so this was the evolution that happened in 2004, and what you see after that is that a huge ramp up in terms of violence. There are some very astounding numbers, and we can talk about that. But just to understand what Maoism, Naxalism is, there's a certain ideology. It is definitely, it takes its inspiration from the Marxist, Leninist, and Maoist thought. It adopts the Mao Zedong's sort of idea of a protracted people's war. So there's a clear ideological inspiration that comes from Maoism, and the overarching sort of goal is to, in a sense, overthrow the Indian state and established its own power. It has a very interesting organizational structure. Like I said, especially after 2004, it had a certain politburo, it had regional committees, it had subcommittees, and the sort of geographic spread also was very interesting. Like I mentioned, a group in the south and in the group in the north and the east came together in 2004, and its heyday at the peak, left-wing extremism affected as many as 190 districts in the country, of which 124 were severely affected, which basically means that one third of India was at one point affected by the problem of left wing extremism. So it was a huge in terms of its geographical spread. In fact, you might have heard about the term called Red Corridor. The term Red Corridor essentially, it's quite a significant idea. Of course, it never saw the light of the day in terms of actual fulfillment, but you saw some aspects of it. So it was basically, a corridor and an aspiration of the Maoists, that there must be a corridor from Pashupati in Nepal to Tirupati in Andhra Pradesh, right? So that was the idea. So it was huge in terms of its ambition, and the whole movement was essentially, had an ideological from sort of a motivation at the top, but on the ground, what it essentially did was it weaponized grievances, it weaponized disenchantment of local populations, especially in tribal areas, and exploited state failures in some of these areas, and in many ways misled local grievances into a grand ideological project. Governance deficits, injustice because of, let's say, the delays in judicial systems, lack of absolute lack of development in some cases. These are grievances that exist in many parts of the country, but in these particular parts of the country, these grievances were extremely exploited, and an entire movement was built on top of that.
You spoke about the fact that they reject India's parliamentary democracy. Now, where does this idea come in from? And like you said, there have been huge gaps in governance and in delivery of intended goals. That was one reason for how it was weaponized at the local levels. But when we talk about a rejection of parliamentary democracy, which I have personally known as a system best for governing the people among whatever options that are available to us, how does that come about? And yeah,
That's a very good question, because the left wing extremists, the Naxals, at one point during at their heyday, created almost a parallel state. Have And what I mean by the parallel system is that it included taxation, it included a judicial, so-called judicial system, which is called the Jantana Adalat. Now, this judicial system essentially, like a kangaroo court, where there would be declarations, where there would be rulings that would be meted out to people who were even remotely suspected of being police informants or informants of the law and order establishment or the Indian state. And in the judgments and the punishments were pre-decided, and they were declared, in these Jan Adalats, as they were called. And most of the cases, you know, the people were killed, the people who were accused of any such, being an informant. So that was the case. There was a lot of extortion from any private contractor who they could get their hands on. There have been cases, lots of cases of kidnapping, extortion. So that was one source of revenue. All of these districts, some of them more than the others, but were influenced by the Naxals. So there were areas where the Indian state couldn't enter in the 2010s, particularly, right? The first decade of this century, first and a little bit of the second decade as well. For example, I was talking to an official, who had the chance to interact with on this particular problem, and the MHA official was telling us that there's a place called Abujmar, for example, in Chhattisgarh, where the government itself, and this is well documented, it's in the public domain, that the government did not have an idea of what exactly is the geographical makeup of this particular area. The mapping of this area was not done. There was a mountain, and the government had no idea about what lies behind the mountain. So you can imagine the kind of lack of interaction with the Indian state that existed here, and in many ways that was exploited because there were genuine grievances as far as lack of development is concerned. There were no roads, etc., and that's also part of the response. When we look at how things have been transformed, it is because of turning around some of these things, and we can talk about that. But essentially, the Naxal thought rejects democracy because democracy is seen as a bourgeoisie enterprise. It is not seen as something that can genuinely address people's aspirations. And the alternative route of so called revolution is sold and is touted as the solution. That's the kind of ideology that it operated with. And obviously, it not only exploited governance grievances, but sometimes, if there's a person who has been wronged by the state in one way or the other, such people were obviously the most vulnerable, and they were the favorite sort of people to be recruited in the project.
Right. But then when we talk about such irreconcilable differences in ideology and in beliefs, then when we talk about elimination, how exactly does that work? I understand that there's a lot of dialogue and negotiation involved as well. How do you overcome this vast difference? And as much as I would like to understand the current elimination strategies that we've been following in the present government, I also want to understand the historical evolution of elimination strategies that have been there, how one thing led to another.
Like I mentioned, 2004 was a very important turning point as far as Naxalism is concerned. Because of that, what you saw in the subsequent years was a rapid and a very significant expansion in the scale of attacks. In the year 2010, it's one of the most deadliest of all attacks. It was 6th of April 2010, when about 76 CRPF personnel were killed in one single morning. In fact, even the insurgencies in other parts of the country, the terrorist groups in, let's say, Jammu and Kashmir, were never able to, stage a single attack that, killed so many security personnel. So this was a huge moment. This was in the year 2010, and this was not isolated. There were several such attacks. There was another attack, for example, just to give you a little bit of a context. There was an attack in 2013 where the entire state political leadership of the Congress party in the state of Chhattisgarh was eliminated in one go. And so many such attacks around this period. Now, obviously, the state had to respond to it, and but in many ways the state was facing a lot of dilemmas in terms of what is the kind of force it would use. Should it, for example, use the army? But the Indian state has always, you know uh, decided against usage of the Indian army in within its hinterland, and that, I think, says a lot about the Indian state as well, right? In terms of it says a lot about its democratic credentials, because in any other single party state, for example, that would have been the course of action, but in India that did not happen. So the state had to calibrate its response very sort of carefully. But of course, it faced a lot of failures at that time. Also, there was a lot of non military or a non militant sort of activity also within the country. So by which basically I mean that the Naxal movement has also enjoyed support from a lot of people in very ordinary urban setups. People in academics, people in think tanks, people in media, people in politics, who essentially legitimize the movement through other means, and that made it difficult for the government to take any strong action over the years, because every time an Naxal would be arrested, there would be a set of people who would come out in terms of a legal and put forward a legal defense in their defense, or they would provide some kind of an intellectual cover with a certain way of covering it in the media. So all of those things also made it tricky for the Indian state to respond. But there were some states who did a better job than the others. For example, in the then United State of Andhra Pradesh, there is something called the Greyhounds, which is also called the Andhra model, which was extremely successful, which basically did two things. One is that it realized that you cannot send in police personnel or paramilitary personnel in a very conventional manner to fight what is essentially a guerrilla warfare force. Because people you were fighting against were very well aware of the terrain that you're talking about, right? So what the Andhra model did is to constitute these greyhounds, which was a force which specialized in jungle warfare. So that's one part of the story. The other thing that it did was it also built a very deep and robust intelligence network. So a lot of people from within the Naxalite movement were in fact recruited to be people who actually are at the front lines of the effort against Naxalism. This was very helpful, right? So there was a certain openness in the Indian security establishment to actually recruit people from the local areas, because they would know the terrain more better than anybody else. So this gave a boost to the human intelligence part of the effort. So once this happened, once the Andhra model came into existence, the other states also started replicating some of these successes. And Chhattisgarh, for example, invested in a lot in local recruitment, inspired by this. Now, what has happened in more recent years is that in 2017, for example, there was the policy, again, a very important decisive policy called Samadhan by the union government. And in fact, if I can actually tell you what it stands for, it says smart leadership, aggressive strategy, motivation and training, actionable intelligence, dashboard based KPIs, harness technology, action plan for each theater, no access to financing. So lot of keywords there, but I think they contain a lot of important elements that give you an understanding of what this strategy was. There was a clear focus on having an integrated approach across the union and the states. There was a lot of encouragement as far as interstate coordination is concerned, center state coordination is concerned, because earlier states would just say, this is not my problem, or why should I spend my resources on fixing this problem. So there was a lot of work that was done to fix that problem, where the police forces of all the states were brought into one platform, because without the cooperation of the state police forces, you could not get local intelligence. So that was one part of it, human intelligence and intelligence coordination. What was also an important part of this Samadhan strategy was technological deployment of resources. The NTRO played a very important role in this. It deployed high altitude drones. They're called Netras by the security forces. There are other kinds of drones, other kinds of UAVs that were also deployed, which gave an extraordinary amount of intelligence even during nighttime, for instance, which did not exist in the previous decades. So that obviously played an important role. A lot of, even in more recent years, AI and other sort of softwares were used to locate some of these key leaders as far as in the core leadership of Naxalism is concerned. And so it was a combination of that. Plus, what you saw in more recent years is also a very important rehabilitation policy. In fact, the rehabilitation policy has been extremely useful, in terms of getting back some of the people who have in many ways been misled into the movement. Because what that does is that it weakens the movement from within, and it does it without kinetic action, which extreme has been extremely important for the Indian security forces again. So it included a mix of financial incentives, but not just financial incentives. There were clear pathways for these people to be integrated into the mainstream. Right? There was a promise of skill development. There was a promise of other ways of being integrated into the sort of mainstream. But security is only one part of the puzzle. Whatever I've said so far is just focusing on the security aspects, but there was very important governance aspect or to this as well. Roads, railways, mobile connectivity, financial inclusion, all of these were areas where the Indian state had pushed forward, because there's this strategy that the Indian state deployed, which is to clear, hold, and build. Right. So whatever I spoke about, the security part of it is only clearing the areas of Naxalism. You had to hold it and then build roads. Right. There have been about 17,000 plus kilometers of roads that have been built. in recent years. Uh, and that's a huge number, right? Particularly when you are basically building a road when somebody on the tree perhaps is waiting to ambush you, right? And in just the last 5 years or so, about you have had about 10 to 12,000 roads, kilometers of roads that have been built. Again, 10,000 mobile towers have been built during this time. You have railways laid in areas where there was no railway track before. You also had a lot of financial inclusion that has been done through post offices. Again, there's in India, post offices also have this dual function of not just being a post office but also an instruments of financial inclusion. So post offices, banking correspondents, all of these different elements of the state presence was expanded into these areas. So that was again extremely helpful. Education, for example, there are a lot of Ekalavya schools that were established in these areas, especially in the core districts, about 35 districts which were most affected. There was a conscious effort to have the top tier of Indian public schools, which is the Kendriya Vidyalayas and Navodayas, right? It was ensured that all of these top affected districts, top left-wing extremism affected districts, have a Kendriya Vidyalaya or have a couple of Navodayas. That again makes a lot of difference. Hospitals were also built because all of these, the importance of all of this is also because for all these decades, especially the last 3 4 decades, the Naxals would never allow you to build any of this, because the moment any of this gets built, the legitimacy of the Naxal movement itself stands weakened, and therefore whenever there was an effort to build an hospital, the people would be blown up or the private contractor would be kidnapped, right? So therefore all of these very basic elements of the state become very extremely very important. So there was the security success, but accompanying it was very clear governance sort of effort.
Thank you for that, because this is exactly what I wanted to come to when you mentioned rehabilitation. In the initial stages, if the government wanted to build something like this, the Naxals wouldn't allow it because it would bring down the legitimacy of their entire movement and struggle. But at the same time, is a movement legitimate if it refuses anybody to help it attain the goals or the ends that it was actually established to achieve? And when we talk about elimination, what exactly are we supposed to understand when the government says that India is free of Naxalism? Are there no people who believe in the ideology? Are there very few people? Are they open to the change, to believing in a different ideology? What does it mean?
So essentially, what the government is saying is, and the facts on the ground are basically saying, is that the leadership, the key leadership of the Naxal movement in India, has been eliminated. So 9 out of 10 people have were eliminated. One is a person who is very aging and who's sort of practically irrelevant, and also I think the key success, and of course, there has to be some dramatic or a significant change that the government is being able to say that it has eliminated or India is Naxal free. And I think last year, 2025, I think in that sense has been extremely important. There was what is called Operation Kagar. That's exactly 1 year back. It was in May 2025 when there was a 21-day siege that the security forces undertook. That is when a lot of the top leadership, whoever was left, were eliminated. And, two particular people, there is somebody called Basavaraju and there is somebody called Madhvi Hidma. These were the two big sort of eliminations per se last year, which almost then made it inevitable that the Naxal movement would, at least in its physical form, can be declared as as defeated. As of today, there are except for 1 or 2 districts, there's no presence at all, and even the presence that I'm talking about is extremely minimal, and that's only that's also more or less eliminated. But physically, there is no threat. Physically, there is no Maoist or Naxal movement anymore in the country. However, I think ideology and ideas, especially when they are so strong and when they have been in operation for such a long time, are not like a tap of water that you can just switch off, right? Physically, yes, you can do that, but in terms of a thought, you may not be able to do that. So the overground support system that the Naxal movement has enjoyed for a long time, many decades in fact, well, one cannot say that it is completely gone because it is very much in existence, because there are people out there who've provided intellectual cover to the Naxal movement for a very long time, and that will remain. But I think that will be, in a sense, irrelevant so long as the grievances are addressed, and so long as, the state will continue its intensity with which it has been addressing and engaging with the people on the ground. So local level engagement becomes extremely important, so that there's no breeding ground, there's no fertile ground for any ideology or any sort of entity to exploit such grievances, because this is something that has happened a lot in the past. What is, I would say, encouraging is, of course, like I said, the rehabilitation policy, where there've been record number of rehabilitations. I mean, if you look at just 2025 alone, there were 2,300 people who surrendered, and in the last 10 to 12 years, there have been about 10,000 plus people who have been surrendered. And these have been people who have been integrated into the mainstream. So it's unprecedented in terms of any armed movement in any part of the world, in terms of the number of people who've been reintegrated into the society. And that, again, I think is a success for the Indian state, because, it's easy to deploy brute force and, things like that. But I think there's a very carefully calibrated balance between, yes, using very strong force coupled with meticulous intelligence wherever necessary, but also opening this door for people who want to join back the mainstream, because a lot of these people actually are not people who are ideologically indoctrinated. These are just people who have been recruited, and sometimes a lot of child recruitment has also happened. Children have been recruited over the decades. And what you see, unfortunately, also, like in any armed movement, in the fag end of its life, the movement is also very desperate, and we saw that with the Naxal movement as well. The number of people that it eliminated in recent years in as part of its Jan Adalats is quite horrifying. I think about 80 people or so just last year, or 2024 perhaps, were eliminated in these Jan Adalats, just on mere suspicion of being uh, anti of the Naxal movement. So that also happened. The legitimacy of the Naxal movement came down crumbling when people started seeing through this. When they could see that the state was able to establish schools, hospitals, it's giving you connectivity, physical connectivity, digital connectivity, and an opportunity really to better one's life, right? There was a lot of focus on skill development. A lot of ITIs were established in these areas, and so that people receive vocational training, people could have education. And I had an opportunity to visit Bastar as well just a couple of years ago, and I could see the kind of integration and engagement that there is. I mean, I did not feel like I am stepping into a zone which is a conflict zone, which, because it by 2024, it was not a conflict zone anymore, right? In a sense, the last one decade, we've all been reading news about Bastar, for example, being the hotbed of Naxalism. But when I was in Bastar, I could see this kind of change, because the roads were accessible. You could drive to any part of the area. You could visit the Chitrakoot waterfalls. You could buy local products. I mean, Chhattisgarh Herbals is today one of the best brands as far as beauty products or cosmetics or shampoos and soaps and eatables is concerned. And the quality of these products is far better than what you get, let's say, in Delhi, for example. So enterprise has entered these areas, and I think that is extremely important, because these were precisely the things that people were kept away from, right? Because when a road is built, it's not just about traffic or transport. It is about a farmer being able to sell their produce, a child being able to go to school through the road, a patient reaching a hospital, the state coming to your doorstep. So all of that is possible when there's physical connectivity, and of course coupled with digital connectivity. So all of these elements have basically broken the back of the legitimacy, whatever that existed, of the Naxal movement.
But earlier, you also made a point that ideas or philosophies are not like taps of water that you can switch off whenever you like. In that regard, one question that I have is that Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism, all three of these ideologies, like all ideas, like is true of all ideas, although they have been adapted and evolved in India based on the circumstances here, but they did not originate here. With regards to influence and ideologies, would you say that there has been some foreign influence in the development of this movement in our country over the years? Or is that a misplaced conception?
No, I think the influence from foreign players has been mixed, and I say that because the inspiration or the influence has certainly been very strong on the ideological front. Left wing extremism in India is fundamentally rooted in the Chinese revolutionary thought in particular, especially Mao Zedong's. Like I said, the ideas of a protracted people's war, encircling cities and towns from all sides of them, and then early Naxalite leaders also very openly proclaimed their allegiance to Mao, and they wanted to model their effort on based on the what they saw in China. So, in terms of ideological inspiration, there was a very clear influence that China in particular and the Maoist and the Marxist-Leninist thought in general had on the left-wing extremism movement in India. In terms of operationally, that has been limited, at least in terms of public evidence that has been very limited in terms of what the government has said about this. Well, the government security agencies might have had some kind of intelligence gathering on this particular subject, but in terms of the public domain, that is limited. When we talk about foreign influence, of course, we talk about China, but there's also other countries which have had, on and off sort of an influence. Again, when I say other countries, not sometimes the state, sometimes the non-state entities. For example, in Nepal, there was a lot of sort of efforts, at least from the Indian Naxals, to coordinate and try and engage with their counterparts in Nepal. There's also been lots of instances where there's been ad hoc sort of help and assistance that the Pakistani ISI has provided to the left wing movement in India, especially in terms of arms and ammunition. But again, these have been sort of sporadic sort of instances where again, several other borders. Sometimes they've been smuggling through Bangladesh route, sometimes through other borders. A lot of arms procurement, sometimes that has happened, through cross-border routes. But a lot of it, majority of it, has actually happened through loot and through theft within the country. So a lot of police stations were looted. A lot of the Indian states' armories were looted. So all of that has definitely been one of the major source. But yes, when it comes to some amount of operational assistance that has happened, but there's no large scale sort of assistance that one can put your finger to. But certainly in terms of propaganda, in terms of narrative warfare, there's been far more support, especially certain entities, NGOs who have had enjoyed support from foreign players, who have also simultaneously provided for certain intellectual cover for the Naxal movement. So that is another area where there one can sort of look for some foreign influence.
Thank you for that clarification. Going back to one of your previous answers where you mentioned that the Indian state's response to this internal security challenge has been unprecedented. When this state demonstrates such capacity to deal with what has been called one of its most consistent and formidable security challenges internally, where does it put the present Indian state on the global map? Or what does it say about us at an international level or about our capacity?
When you look at the ideas in that we study in the field of international relations, there is something called comprehensive national power. I think the ending of Naxalism certainly boosts India's comprehensive national power, and it does so in a number of ways. It does so by boosting internal security, economic growth, and also India's ability to, in a sense, project power externally. What this clearly means is that the Indian state is sort of demonstrating its capability to counter a decades long Naxal movement, which rejects the Indian state itself. It has successfully been able to put that down. So it obviously boosts the Indian state's credibility and credentials, especially from a security perspective, right? Uh, because, like I said, at one point there was one third of the country that was influenced by this in one way or the other. It also shows a certain resilience that, even though the Indian state might not have solved it in its initial years, eventually it did. And that sort of shows you a certain resilience that the Indian state is capable of. It also, I think, goes to show the power of the democracy itself to, in a sense, course correct, self correct when it comes to certain deficiencies. So, if there was governance deficit, and sometimes there was no governance at all in some of these areas, the Indian state has again, and the democratic system has shown that it has the ability to, correct such anomalies and therefore, cater to people's aspirations. what it also does is, in a sense, because, again, if you look at it from a foreign or a external perspective, if India wants to really attract investment, the most basic prerequisite is internal stability, right? Of course, a lot of investment, one can argue, is flowing into cities which are very stable, like Hyderabad or Pune or Mumbai, etc. But at some point, India will have to attract investment into its hinterland as well, and the kind of goals, the economic development goals that India has, Viksit Bharat by 2047, that is not going to happen without the economic development and social upliftment of people who come from these areas who have been affected by decades long conflicts. So, given that that's the reality and that's an imperative that India faces, this particular development in the last 1 or 2 years, which basically marks the end of Naxalism, becomes extremely important, because if economic growth of India as a country has to happen, it will have to happen from these areas. So that is again extremely important. But most of all, I think, especially from an external point of view, what this does is that it frees up a lot of India's own military or security and administrative bandwidth, because a lot of that was spent in solving this problem, especially in the last decade, especially since 2017. I've spoken to some of the officials in the Ministry of Home Affairs, and they tell me how the Home Minister himself was monitoring this on a very regular basis, right? And the Home Ministry is one of the biggest ministries in India, right? So for the Union Home Minister himself to monitor this on a regular basis obviously means that a certain bandwidth was being spent, and rightly so, on this particular issue. But with the, in a sense, the success that we've seen, that bandwidth now can be deployed elsewhere, and the same can be extrapolated to the Indian state in general, right? So that allows India to project its power to security challenges at its borders, right? Which again are obviously a subject onto itself. But the ability of the Indian state to address the challenges at its borders, to address and act upon its aspirations in the Indo-Pacific region, for instance, that is something that is enabled because of an internal security success. Right. So, yes, there is a lot of infrastructure and economic development related sort of opportunities that this creates, but it also creates opportunities from a strategic perspective, where India is able to project power externally and at its borders in a much better way than it would have if this problem kept festering on. So that, I think, is very sort of going to be extremely important as far as an external implication is concerned.
When we speak about issues such as these from the comforts of our homes, as somebody who has traveled to these areas, who has followed the development of this movement over the years, is there something that you would say that one must keep in mind?
Absolutely. I think it's a certain responsibility as well that all of us have towards people from our own country, right? In a way, one has to look at these areas not from a lens of conflict, but I think through a lens of aspiration, right? The aspiration of somebody in Jagdalpur is as important as somebody who is in Jamshedpur or in Mumbai or in Delhi. So the aspirations have to be respected, and not just respected, but also acted upon. There's a lot that people in India can do for the benefit of these areas, introducing people to enterprise in a very organic manner, empowering people to take their own fate into their own hands. These are ideas and these are ways of life that have been kept away from people in these areas, right? Education obviously is extremely important, and like I said, a lot of schools have been built in these areas, but the schools also need a willing participation of people from outside, in terms of teachers, in terms of doctors in hospitals. So these are areas of service that I think are real tangible ways in which one can contribute. And ultimately, like you said, one has to keep in mind is that these are real people that we are talking about, and the security and the governance landscapes get transformed when people, in a sense, get transformed. And I think that is something that is extremely important, and no effort is successful unless the people are at the center of it, right? So the responsiveness with which the Indian state has catered to their aspirations and to their difficulties and address their difficulties is something that has to be continued, because we all, I mean, all of us have faced the difficulties of dealing with the government, right? Walk into a government office, and I don't think there'll be a lot of people who will say, oh, the government office is a pleasant experience. We all face issues because of bureaucratic delays, judicial delays, bureaucratic inefficiencies, and let's face it, bureaucratic arrogance as well. Now, this is something that every citizen in India has faced at some point or the other. But the point is, and that's the point, the whole point of countering a movement like Naxalism, is that you cannot have a maximalist, violent solution to problems that in many ways might be genuine. So, like every other part of the country, which constantly pushes the envelope on good governance, on accountable governance, and to building a safe and secure environment for our people. The areas that have been affected in previous decades by Naxalism are no different in that sense. The effort is the same, the goals are in a sense the same, the aspirations to some extent are also the same. But we've just had different trajectories. Some places in the country have had different trajectories, while some areas have not, and they've suffered through conflict, because of conflict. So I think that kind of empathy, I think, is what I think is required among people, across the country. And I think that that will go a long way in, reaching out and engaging in constructive and in productive ways that can, integrate people in a true sense.
To summarize it, it's important to not only remember, but also to make consistent efforts to realize that there's nobody who deserves to be left behind in any sort of a way. And wherever you are, there is something or the other that can be done and must be done. But thank you so much for joining us today and for having a deeply insightful conversation, for sharing your research as well as your experience in the field with us. I hope there's a lot to take back for the viewers from this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.